Iran, beautiful and mysterious, is a vast plateau land of mountains and valleys and deserts. But only 12% of the land can support crops. Half of Iran's 35 million population are farmers, using centuries-old technology to provide little more than the bare necessities of life. Rural incomes are low. Iranians live in walled villages and towns, which are often isolated and remote. Transport is limited too, for village life has changed little in hundreds of years. Modern Iran is very different. 40% of the population live in towns where modern buildings jostle with the domes and minarets of an earlier age. The role of Muhammad and the mosques is central to real understanding of modern Iran. Any country which has been catapulted into the 20th century in 50 years may feel the need to cling to its traditions. Iranian politics are interwoven with Muslim beliefs in a complex pattern that stretches from the lowest to the highest. Sometimes the government and the Muslim clergy are in agreement, so order and tradition prevail. But should the government trample on what the mullahs regard as their privileges and prerogatives, there can be trouble. In the dark recesses of the bazaar, the old and the new orders plot against each other in a welter of conflicting interest groups. Ancient Iranians were Zoroastrians, fire worshippers. Christianity in Iran goes back to the day of Pentecost. On that day, Peter preached to Parthians and Medes, who lived in Persia, as Iran was then called. To go back even earlier, there's a tradition that the 3 wise men who came to Bethlehem to worship Jesus came from Persia. When the Arabian armies of militant Islam invaded in the 7th century with fire and the sword, Christianity had been established for 400 years. After the conquest, Christians, like the Jews and Zoroastrians, were permitted to remain, but the restrictions they lived under made them in effect second-class citizens. They were free to follow Christ unhindered, always providing that they didn't attempt to make converts from among the Muslim majority. To be Iranian was to be Muslim. Christians were classified as foreigners. Here in Isfahan, nearly 200 years ago, Henry Martin, an Englishman, first translated the New Testament into Persian. When he wished to present it to the Muslim ruler of the day, Fath Ali Shah, he chose to do so through the British ambassador, Sir Gore Ouseley. So, Christians in modern Iran were identified as foreigners. British and American missionaries were allowed to enter the country during the 19th century. They set up hospitals and schools, pioneering medicine and education in an essentially feudal country. By 1912, the Church Missionary Society had established churches, hospitals and schools in the 4 southern towns of Isfahan, Yazd, Ahwaz and Shiraz. The local Muslim leaders were prepared to accept the medical work, but forbade Muslim parents to send their children to Christian schools. Gradually, the situation improved. By 1961, the first Iranian bishop of Iran was consecrated, Bishop H.B. Dekwani Tafti. Little did he know what was to come. Modern Western involvement with Iran began with the discovery of oil at the turn of the century. Oil rapidly became its greatest economic asset, and Abadan one of the world's largest oil refineries. In 1941, Mohammad Reza Shah, with British support, took over from his father, who'd begun to modernize Iran in the 20s. The Allies needed to secure the oil for themselves and prevent it reaching the Axis powers. 10 years later, the first major challenge to his rule came with the election of leftist Dr. Mossadegh, who promptly nationalized the British-owned oil fields. The Shah and Westerners, including the missionaries, were forced to leave Iran, a foretaste of events 25 years later. But with the fall and subsequent trial of Dr. Mossadegh, the Shah regained control. Western interests, including the missionaries, returned. In 1961, thousands of title deeds changed hands when the Shah began his policy of enforced land redistribution. Millions of acres belonging to the big landowners and the Muslim clergy were parceled out among peasant farmers who were naturally delighted. But the former owners could neither forgive nor forget. 2 years later, the Shah proclaimed from his marble palace the emancipation of women in terms of voting rights and other reforms. The Muslim clergy saw this as further evidence of the Shah's attack on their conservative beliefs. All signs of opposition were relentlessly suppressed by SAVAK, the Shah's hated secret police, who used imprisonment, torture, and execution. Behind SAVAK was the army, a huge and privileged force of men. The Shah lavished billions of dollars on his troops and their equipment. The army was also given the task of spearheading rural education, the Shah's so-called White Revolution. Soldiers were sent out into the villages to teach with varying success in the face of 70% illiteracy figure. Soldiers also provided basic agricultural advice for villagers. By 1977, after 26 years of rule, the Shah felt secure enough to crown himself king. On his 48th birthday, he rose from his golden throne, studded with 27,000 jewels, kissed the Quran, and took the crown. Watched by his son, Crown Prince Reza, he seemed to be secure at last. Buying technology and expertise wherever it was for sale, Iran bulldozed its way into the forefront of emergent nations. Spurning the precept that nations should learn to walk before they can run, the Shah had masterminded the molding of a modern, dynamic, industrial Iran. He'd been at the forefront of the OPEC nations' decision to treble the price of oil. With $22 billion a year, Iran then embarked on a stampede of development. She consolidated her position as the foremost power in the Gulf. U.S. arms poured in at the rate of $10 billion a year. He had U.S. Phantoms, British tanks, and a fleet of seagoing military hovercraft. U.S. presidents, from Kennedy to Carter, regarded the Shah as the ideal ruler to secure the interests of the West in the Gulf area, now that the British had left. But the contrast between the past and the future remained too glaring. Although Iran bought into Western companies and invested millions in Asia and Africa, many Iranians remained poor and illiterate. Teachers and trained personnel remained in short supply. Agricultural performance was low, industrial productivity disappointing. In the towns, the pockets of poverty were obvious. Sheep wandered among the debris of over-rapid urbanization. In 1978, serious religious disturbances in Qom shook the Shah's military despotism. Qom is a holy city 94 miles south of Tehran and center of the Shia sect of Islam. All signs of modernization, like women's emancipation, were sternly resisted. Here, the Ayatollah Shariat Madari, a revered Islamic scholar, publicly dared to voice his opposition to the Shah on constitutional and religious grounds. He joined other Islamic leaders already in exile in demanding the restoration of Islamic law, the Sharia, and closer observance of religious customs. His statements led to demonstrations by Islamic militants in cities all over the country. Ayatollah Khomeini, who'd been sending audio tapes from Paris to the faithful in Iran for many months, now urged all Muslims to resist in every way they could. If necessary, they were to sacrifice their lives. The Shah's answer to the riots was iron repression by the police and the army, who were sent onto the streets in force. But the revolution had now begun, and Ayatollah Khomeini urged the army not to fire on their Muslim brothers. Before long, the troops were joining the demonstrators. Portraits of the Ayatollahs Shariat Madari and Khomeini appeared everywhere. Ominous graffiti threatened death to infidels. Under such popular pressures, the very fabric of the Shah's power began to crumble. Strikes and riots became a daily occurrence. The police seemed to be powerless, and the army remained in their barracks. Long queues for food and fuel intensified the atmosphere of revolutionary change. On the 16th of January 1979, the Shah left Iran. He was never to return. The whole country waited breathlessly for the man who'd become a hero in exile. Ayatollah Khomeini took an Air France 747 back to Iran. He'd won even before he set foot on Iranian soil. On the surface, Iranians seemed passionately united behind Khomeini when he returned. But underneath there were serious differences between the clergy and the rightists, who wanted a return to an Islamic Iran, and the Democrats and the left, who wanted a secular Iran freed of the Shah. Khomeini skillfully avoided an early split by encouraging Iranians to unite in their dislike of the Shah and the foreign influences that he'd introduced, and especially the Americans.